The slap landed before anyone in the room had time to blink. 1 second, Commander Harlan Voss stood in front of the entire training hall, hand raised, teeth showing, and the next, Lieutenant Sarah Calloway's cheek bore the full weight of his open palm in front of 40 witnesses who went completely silent. He smiled, he actually smiled, because he had done this before, to others, and no one had ever done a thing about it. He had no idea that the woman holding her face with one hand had once kept 3 special operators alive in a collapsed building with nothing but her bare hands and a field kit. He had no idea, but he was about to find out. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to watch is the kind that will keep you up at night. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere. This one goes places you will not expect. The morning Sarah Calloway reported to Hartwell Military Medical Center in Caldwell, Virginia. The sky outside was doing that thing it does in late October, gray and flat, and pressed down low like a lid on something trying to boil. She drove through the main gate in a civilian Honda with a cracked left mirror, showed her orders to the gate sentry without conversation, and parked in the last row of the staff lot, because the map she'd been sent marked it as closest to the side entrance. That detail alone, the choice of entrance, told anyone paying attention something about how she moved through the world. She had a way of finding the edges of rooms before she settled into them. She was 31 years old, dark hair pulled back without ceremony, flat expression that people sometimes mistook for coldness, and that was in fact neither cold nor warm, just still. She'd been told before that she made people uncomfortable when she wasn't performing the kind of softness they expected from a woman in nursing scrubs. And she had filed that information away the same way she filed most things, noted, stored, not acted upon. Her paperwork said she was a registered nurse, combat medicine certified, prior military service record partially classified. She'd been assigned to the surgical recovery ward on a 6-month temporary rotation, brought in because Hartwell was understaffed, and the region's reserve pool had exactly 2 nurses with her qualifications, and the other one had a newborn at home. She didn't know anyone here. That was fine. She wasn't here to make friends. The charge nurse at the surgical ward was a woman named Patty Oakes, mid-50s, short and efficient, and running on what appeared to be institutional black coffee. She met Sarah at the ward entrance with a clipboard and a look that wasn't unfriendly exactly, but was also very clearly evaluating. "Calloway," Patty said. "Not a question." "Yes, ma'am." "Call me Patty. We're not in the field." She turned and started walking, expecting Sarah to follow. "You've got 8 patients on rotation this morning. 2 post-op abdominals, 3 orthopedic recoveries, 2 chest drains, 1 head trauma in monitoring. I'll walk you through. Any questions before we start? Where do you keep the secondary supply kits?" Pot stopped briefly, just a half-step pause. "Most nurses ask where the break room is." "I'll find that myself," Sarah said. Something in Patty's face shifted, very slightly, in a direction that might have been approval. The ward was functional and clean, and slightly overcrowded in the way military medical facilities often were: beds too close, curtain tracks that didn't quite reach, monitors stacked on carts pushed against walls. The patients were all active duty or veterans, most of them young, most of them doing what injured service members do, trying to seem fine while not being fine. Sarah had cared for enough of them to know the look. You watched their hands, not their faces. Their faces were trained. Their hands told the truth. She moved through the morning the way she moved through most things, without wasted motion, without drawing attention, and without making anyone feel like they were being processed. She had a way of sitting on the edge of a patient's conversation that made them feel like she was listening, even when she was also reading a chart, because she actually was listening. She'd learned that in places where the difference between catching something early and missing, it entirely could be measured in blood pressure drops and minutes. By 11 in the morning, she had learned the ward. By noon, she had quietly corrected 1 medication documentation error and flagged a patient's drain output that was running slightly high, noted it, told Patty, moved on. She did not announce any of this. That was not how she operated. She ate lunch alone in the break room with a protein bar and a cup of bad coffee, and read the orientation packet she hadn't had time to read before arriving. It mentioned, in the bureaucratic language of military administration, that Hartwell had recently restructured its training and evaluation protocols under the authority of Commander Harlan Voss, who oversaw physical readiness assessments for all non-combat designated personnel, including medical staff. She turned the page. The mandatory physical readiness evaluation for new non-combat staff was scheduled for 1,400 hours in the main training facility, Building 7. She checked her watch. She had 40 minutes. Building 7 smelled the way all military training halls smell: rubber matting and old sweat, and the particular kind of industrial cleaner that never quite wins. There were already about 30 people assembled when Sarah arrived, a mix of medical staff, administrative personnel, and a handful of newer unit support members. They stood in loose clusters, a few talking quietly, most watching the front of the room, where 3 uniformed figures were setting up near a row of equipment stations. Commander Harlan Voss stood in the center of that group. He was the kind of man who filled space more than his actual size warranted. Not tall, not unusually built, but there was something deliberately occupying about the way he stood weight forward, shoulders angled out, eyes moving across the room with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years identifying who in a group was likely to push back and who wasn't. He had the face of a man who had never been genuinely surprised and intended to keep it that way. He caught Sarah's eye for approximately half a second when she found a spot near the back wall. Then his gaze moved on, which was fine. The assessment was standard: push-up count, a timed run on an indoor track, basic flexibility evaluation, and a defensive response demonstration that Hartwell apparently required of all non-combat staff as part of updated safety protocols. Someone near Sarah murmured that Voss had pushed through the defensive response requirement himself 6 months ago, something about liability and documented incidents. She listened to this without responding. The first 45 minutes ran without incident. Sarah completed the push-up station, the track segment, the flexibility portion, without distinguishing herself in either direction. She was competent. She was not visibly exceptional. She had spent enough years being evaluated by people with authority over her to know that there were situations where competence was the correct performance and situations where something else was required. And this, she had already determined, was a competent situation. Then they moved to the defensive response demonstration. Voss walked the group through the protocol himself. The demonstration required each participant to respond to a simulated physical approach, a training partner stepping into their space, extending a hand toward the shoulder. The response was supposed to be a verbal command, a step back and a blocking position. Textbook, choreographed. The purpose, at least officially, was to document that medical staff could respond to aggressive patients. That was the official purpose. Sarah watched 3 people go through it. Voss corrected each of them with the particular kind of precision that wasn't about helping them improve. It was about showing the room that he could find the flaw in anything, that his eye was the final word, that the correct response to his correction was adjustment and deference. The third person, a young administrative specialist who couldn't have been more than 23, fumbled the blocking position twice and stood there with red ears, while Voss ran through exactly what she'd done wrong in front of everyone without ever raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. Then Voss called Sarah's name. She walked to the center of the mat. His training partner, a junior enlisted man, who looked like he'd been briefed to go easy on the medical staff, positioned himself across from her. Voss watched her with the flat professional assessment of someone who already knew what he was going to see. "Ready when you are, Lieutenant." The training partner stepped forward, right hand extending toward her left shoulder, the scripted approach. She performed the response correctly. Verbal command. Step back, blocking position, clean by the protocol, by the sheet. Voss tilted his head again. She did it again. Same result. "Your footwork's off." She looked at him. Her footwork was not off. Several people in the room knew it wasn't off. She could tell from the way one of the older master chiefs near the equipment rack had gone very still. "Yes, sir," she said, again. "And this time actually move your feet." She moved through the protocol a third time with the same controlled precision, and Voss watched the whole thing with the expression of a man who had decided before she walked to the mat that there was going to be a problem, and the problem was going to be her, because that was how the math worked in his room. "You're not listening," he said. He walked toward her. The footwork. Watch, he demonstrated, stepping into the space they'd been using. Close, demonstrating the movement while talking through it, the way an instructor does. Except he didn't stop at demonstration. His hand came up. Not the training partner's, his open palm. And it connected with the side of her face with a crack that went through the entire room, like something breaking. Complete silence. Voss's expression was one of impatient instruction, as if the slap had been pedagogical, a correction, a calibration. His eyes held the particular confidence of someone who had done this before, and watched people stand there and take it and say nothing, and go on with their day and file nothing and report nothing, and understand in the bone-deep, institutional way that this was simply how things worked. For approximately 1.5 seconds, Sarah stood exactly where she was. Her hand had not gone to her cheek. Her expression had not crumpled. She was looking at Voss the way she looked at a lot of things still, taking inventory. Then she moved. It happened fast enough that most of the room didn't fully reconstruct it until later, in their own minds when they were lying awake. She didn't throw a punch. She didn't escalate to something that could be coded as aggressive. What she did was a precise redirection. She caught the forward momentum from Voss's follow-through, used it, and in the space of about 2 seconds, Commander Harlan Voss was on the mat on his back flat, looking up at the training hall ceiling, with an expression that was, for the first time, completely blank. She stepped back, clasped her hands in front of her, waited. The silence in the room was the specific kind that happens when 40 people are simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they knew about a situation. Voss got up slowly. His face was working through something, the shock moving into something harder and colder and more deliberate, the machinery of authority re-engaging under the surface. "You just assaulted a superior officer," he said. His voice was even. That was almost worse. "You struck me first, sir," Sarah said, in front of witnesses. Something moved across his face. Then it closed. "Everyone is dismissed. Lieutenant Calloway, report to the duty officer." Near the equipment rack, Master Chief Dominic Rourke had not moved. He was watching Sarah with an expression that had nothing to do with what had just happened on the mat and everything to do with something further back, some other recognition, something older. He'd seen that technique. He'd seen exactly that technique in a debrief video years ago, in a context that had nothing to do with a Virginia military hospital. He kept that to himself for now. Sarah walked off the mat, retrieved her water bottle from the wall, and left Building 7. She did not look back. The duty officer she was sent to was a lieutenant commander named Gary Holt, who had the demeanor of a man being slowly crushed by the administrative weight of every situation he'd ever been handed that he hadn't asked for. He read the incident report that had arrived on his screen before Sarah did, which was itself a signal Voss had been fast, very fast. Holt looked at her over the edge of his monitor. "You want to walk me through what happened?" "Commander Voss struck me in the face during a training demonstration. I responded with a defensive technique. He says the physical contact was part of a demonstration, and that response exceeded the protocol. He struck me with an open palm. That's not in any demonstration protocol I was briefed on." Holt looked back at his screen. He had the body language of a man who was fairly certain which version of events was accurate, and was now quietly calculating what that meant for his afternoon. "There's going to be a formal complaint filed," he said. "Hey. I'm aware. Do you have anything you want on record at this point?" Sarah considered the question the way she considered most things, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular patience of someone who was deciding how much of a thing to show. "Yes," she said. "I want on record that I was struck in the face without warning in front of approximately 40 witnesses, that the technique I used was a proportional defensive response, and that I'm happy to have the entire incident reviewed, frame by frame, if the training hall cameras were running." Holt wrote something down. He did not meet her eyes while he was writing. She was sent back to the surgical ward pending review, told to continue her patient duties, and informed that the formal process would take several days. Standard language. Standard process. She returned to the ward. Patty Oakes looked at her face when she walked in. The mark on her cheek from the slap had mostly faded, but Patty had been in military medicine long enough to read the geometry of a situation without needing the full briefing. She didn't ask. She handed Sarah a chart and tilted her head toward the second bed on the left. Post-op abdominal, Mr. Wes Harmon, 38, service member. He was running a slight temp at noon. Check it again. Sarah checked it. The temp had climbed half a degree. Pulse was up a few beats. She noted it, documented it, flagged it to the physician on call, and moved on because that was what you did. You stayed in the work. Because the work didn't pause for your circumstances. And Wes Harmon's body didn't care what had happened in Building 7 at 1,400 hours. It was later, after rounds, after vitals, after she had done the thing she always did at the end of a shift, when she stood at the break room window for exactly 2 minutes and looked at whatever was outside and said nothing, that she let herself think about what had happened. Not the slap specifically. She'd been in situations that made a slap look like a footnote. What she was thinking about was the room, the 40 people, the specific quality of silence after Voss went down, and then the quality of silence after he got up and started talking, and how those two silences were almost exactly the same, which meant that most of the people in that room were still calculating, still watching to see which way the weight fell, still deciding whether what they had witnessed was something they could afford to acknowledge. That was always the harder problem. Not the man who hit you. The room her phone buzzed, unknown caller, a military prefix she didn't immediately recognize. She answered, Lieutenant Calloway. The voice was male senior, with the particular cadence of someone who chose words the way a navigator chose waypoints. My name is Master Chief Dominic Rourke. We were in the same room today. I'm going to ask you to stay on the line for 60 seconds and hear me out. She stayed on the line. I've seen that response technique before, Rourke said. Twice, both times in classified footage that doesn't exist in any open record. The second time I saw it, the person using it was operating in a theater that I cannot name on this call. I've spent the last 3 hours trying to figure out why a nurse on a 6-month rotation would know it. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Are you asking me a question, Master Chief, or making a statement? I'm telling you that I contacted someone today. Someone who's been watching Hartwell for a while now, for reasons that have nothing to do with you. And I think Rourke said carefully that what happened in Building 7 today might have cracked something open that Voss very much needed to stay shut. She looked out the break room window at the dark parking lot, at her cracked mirror Honda in the last row. How many complaints? She asked. Rourke went quiet for just a beat, surprised, she thought, that she'd known what to ask. We don't have a final count yet, he said. But there are more. Yes, Lieutenant, there are more. She stood there with the phone against her ear and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. She'd walked into a hospital to take care of patients. She'd done her job, filed herself into the background, tried to be a quiet presence in a ward full of people who needed consistency and precision more than they needed personality. And Harlan Voss had walked into a training hall and made a choice, in front of 40 witnesses, about who he thought she was. That was his miscalculation. Not because she would go looking for what was underneath it, but because the people who'd already been looking had just found the thread they'd been missing, and Voss, by striking her in a room full of cameras, had handed it to them with both hands. She said goodnight to Rourke and ended the call. In the morning, she would return to the ward. She would check Wes Harmon's temp. She would do her rounds. She would be exactly what she had come here to be. But somewhere across Caldwell, a phone call was traveling up a chain of command that Harlan Voss didn't know had been watching him. And the people on the other end of that call were not the kind you could talk down, or redirect or bury. They were the kind who arrived in vehicles, and they were already on their way. They came at 617 the next morning. Sarah was already on the ward when she heard them, not the vehicles themselves, not from the surgical wing, but the particular shift in ambient sound that a facility makes when something unexpected enters it. Voices lowering, footsteps changing pace, the way a building holds its breath without anyone deciding to hold it. She was checking drain output on the chest tube patient in bed 4, a retired warrant officer named Dale Fuchs, who'd had a rough night and was now awake and watching her with the particular suspicion of a man who had been in enough hospitals to know that nurses arriving before shift change was measured. Expressions were often the advanced signal of bad news. She marked his chart, told him his output was tracking better than the previous read, and left him with the grudging nod of a man who had wanted to argue and found no opening. The hallway outside the ward showed her the tail end of what had come through the front entrance. 2 black SUVs still visible through the glass doors at the corridor's far end. Men in uniform who weren't Hartwell's uniforms. Civilians with lanyards that weren't Hartwell's lanyards. They'd come in through the administrative entrance, not the main lobby, which meant they'd arranged access before they arrived, which meant this had been planned before dawn. Patty materialized at Sarah's elbow. She had a way of doing that, appearing without preamble, already mid-thought. You know what that is? She asked quietly, not looking at Sarah directly. Both of them, watching the corridor, the way you watch something through a window when you don't want to be seen doing it. Not specifically, Sarah said. I've seen that kind of entrance twice in my career, Patty said. Neither time was social. She walked back to the nursing station without waiting for a response, and Sarah returned to her rounds, because whatever was happening at the administrative end of Hartwell Military Medical Center was not happening on the surgical ward, and Wes Harmon in bed 2 had a temperature that had ticked up another quarter degree overnight, and needed her attention more than the distant sound of institutional machinery beginning to grind. His temp was 99.4, not alarming on its own. In context, a post-operative abdominal patient, day 3, combined with a pulse running 5 beats higher than his previous baseline, and the way he'd been holding very still when she walked in, the particular stillness of someone trying to keep something from hurting it, it formed a picture she didn't like. How's the pain? She asked. Fine, he said, which was what service members said when the honest answer was something else entirely. She'd learned years ago not to argue with the word. You asked adjacent questions instead. On a scale of your best days versus your worst days in the field, where are you sitting right now? Harmon looked at her. Something in his face reconsidered. Maybe a 6. When you came in yesterday, you were a 3. Yeah. She noted it, flagged it to the attending doctor, Yolanda Marsh, who was making rounds in the orthopedic wing and said she'd be over within the hour. Sarah documented the flag with a timestamp and moved on, because that was the work, accumulating small observations into a pattern that someone with surgical authority could act on, and doing it without dramatizing, without alarm, without the escalation that made patients panic and made physicians feel crowded. She was at the nursing station writing up the flag when Dominic Rourke appeared in the ward doorway. He was out of uniform civilian clothes, which on a Master Chief had the slightly wrong fit of something worn under obligation rather than preference. He looked at her the way he'd sounded on the phone, deliberate, choosing what to show. "You have a few minutes," he asked. "I'm on shift, I know. This won't take long." She stepped out into the hallway, leaving the ward door open, so she could still see Patty at the station. Rourke positioned himself with his back to the wall, which she noted not paranoid positioning, just the habit of someone who'd spent decades making sure he could see the room. "The people who came in this morning," he said. "They're from the DoD Inspector General's office and a JSOC legal team. They've been building a file on Voss for approximately 8 months. She waited. "The complaint system here has been compromised. Multiple formal complaints filed against Voss over the past decade, at least. That's the current working assumption, were diverted before they reached the investigative level. Someone above Voss was managing the paper. Who? That's what they're here to determine. But there's a name in circulation." He said it flatly, without theatrical weight. "Captain Reeve Donlan. He's been Hartwell's senior command officer for 4 years. He and Voss have a relationship that goes back further than this posting." Sarah leaned against the opposite wall with her arms folded. Down the corridor, she could hear the muffled, professional sound of investigators conducting themselves, the soft rhythm of questions being asked in closed rooms. "How many complaints?" "Current documentation shows 23 confirmed. They think there are more that were never formally entered." 23 was the number, he said. She heard it the way you hear a number that's large enough to stop being abstract. It became faces. It became people standing in rooms the way she'd stood in that training hall, standing there afterward and calculating in that particular silence exactly how much it would cost them to speak. "What do they need from me?" she asked. "Your statement. And your willingness to have your background reviewed as part of establishing the nature of Voss's targeting pattern. He went after you specifically, they think, because your classification level made your record look thin. Someone who looked junior and undocumented." She absorbed that. Voss had looked at her partially redacted record and seen a target. He had looked at the gaps, the years that weren't there in the open record, because they'd been classified at a level that didn't show on a routine background pull, and he'd seen vulnerability. An easy mark. Someone who would have no institutional weight to throw behind a complaint, no visible histories of survival in theaters that would make other people pause. He'd been doing this for 10 years. To people he'd made the same calculation about. "I'll give a statement," she said. Rourke nodded. He started to leave, then stopped. Old habit, she'd seen it in seasoned operators, the pause before the thing they actually came to say. "They're going to ask about your background. You don't have to volunteer anything. Your classification doesn't require you to disclose. But whatever you do choose to put on record, make it consistent, because Donlan's attorneys are going to be looking for contradictions." "Master Chief," she said, "I've given testimony in rooms that don't officially exist. I can handle a DoD interview." Something shifted in his face recognition, she thought, or the edge of it. He left. She went back to the ward. The formal interview happened at 1100 hours, in a conference room on the smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. The investigator was a civilian attorney named Prentice Gale, somewhere in his mid-40s, who had the practiced neutrality of someone who'd sat across from a wide range of people and made a professional habit of not signaling what he thought of any of them. He had a recorder on the table and a colleague beside him who took handwritten notes in a way that seemed redundant until you understood that the handwritten notes were for a different file than the recording. Gale walked her through the events of the previous afternoon with the systematic thoroughness of zusammenhängende structure, not exploring a narrative, times, positions in the room. What was said, what she observed, the sequence of physical events, her response, the immediate aftermath. He didn't push, he didn't lead. He asked clean questions and waited for clean answers and wrote nothing on his own notepad, because he already had everything he needed from the recording. When he reached the background portion, he set the recorder's display so she could see it running, and asked if she was comfortable proceeding. "Service record is partially classified," she said. "I can confirm prior military service and combat medicine experience. The specific nature and theater of that service isn't something I can detail without authorization." "We're aware of your classification tier," Gale said. He said it without surprise, which meant he'd already had that conversation with someone who had the clearance to explain it to him. "I'm not asking you to disclose protected information. I'm asking whether, in your professional assessment, the technique you used to respond to Commander Voss's physical contact was proportional to the threat as you perceived it." "Yes." "Can you explain your assessment?" "He struck me without warning in a controlled setting with no active threat present. I neutralized the immediate physical contact with a technique that caused no injury and posed no ongoing risk to him or to anyone else in the room." Gale looked at her for a moment in the way that attorneys sometimes looked at witnesses they'd decided were going to be useful. "One more question, and then we'll conclude this portion. In your experience, and you can answer this as broadly or as specifically as you think appropriate, does Commander Voss's behavior in the training hall yesterday appear consistent to you with an isolated incident or with an established pattern?" She thought about the 23 complaints. She thought about the particular confidence with which Voss had smiled while she was still processing the blow. Confidence of a man who'd done this before and watched the machinery of the institution close around it like water closing over a stone. "Established pattern," she said. Gale clicked off the recorder. "Thank you, Lieutenant." She was back on the ward by noon. What happened next happened quietly, and then very fast, which was how institutional things tended to move when they finally moved at all. Long stillness, then a sudden shift of weight, like a structure that's been eroding for years, and then one morning is simply no longer standing. By mid-afternoon, Voss had been removed from his duties pending investigation. The language in the internal memo that circulated through Hartwell's command structure was careful administrative review, precautionary measure, but everyone who'd been inside a military facility long enough to read the code understood what those phrases meant. He was out of the building. He was not coming back in. Sarah heard this from Patty, who had heard it from the administrative coordinator 2 floors up, who had heard it from someone in the command suite. The information moved through Hartwell, the way information always moved through military facilities, officially through channels, actually through the connective tissue of people who'd worked in the same building long enough to have the relationships that the org chart didn't map. She was checking vitals on Dale Fuchs when Patty told her, and she nodded and finished what she was doing and made a note on his chart before she allowed herself to think about what it meant. It meant less than it looked like, and she knew it. An administrative removal was not an accountability. It was a holding position, the institution protecting itself from further damage, while it determined how much of the structure was load-bearing. Voss out of the building was not Voss facing consequences. Donlan still had his rank. The 23 complaints were still filed by people who'd been told explicitly or implicitly that the system had heard them and decided not to act. That part wasn't over. That part was in some ways just beginning. Wes Harmon's temperature was 99.8 when she checked it at 1,400. His pulse had climbed again. He was holding himself differently, in the bed, not consciously. She didn't think. But the body makes adjustments around pain that the conscious mind doesn't always track, and his adjustments were the kind that made the back of her neck go tight. She got Dr. Marsh on the phone. Marsh was in a procedure and couldn't break, but she listened while Sarah ran through the progression, temp trajectory, pulse trend, Harmon's self-reported pain scaling, the postural changes, the way his abdomen had felt on palpation that morning, the absence of bowel sounds at the position she'd checked 20 minutes ago. "Order a point-of-care ultrasound," Marsh said. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. "He doesn't look like he has 40 minutes of comfortable," Sarah said, which was not alarmist language. It was specific and clinical, and she knew the difference. A brief pause on Marsh's end. "Get the ultrasound now. I'll call from the procedure suite. If what you're seeing looks like what I think it might be, pull the crash cart to his bay and get Dr. OC from Vascular on the phone." She was already moving before the call ended. The portable ultrasound took 4 minutes to arrive, because Sarah had moved to where she knew it was stored rather than waiting for someone to bring it, and because she'd already told the orderly on the way past where she was going. The image came up gray and shifting and immediate, and what it showed was not ambiguous to someone who knew what to look for, which she did, from places and in circumstances that had nothing to do with this recovery ward. There was fluid where fluid should not be. The distribution was wrong. The volume was wrong. The picture it made, assembled from all the small things she'd been flagging since morning, was the picture of a post-operative bleed that had been slow and had been quiet and had now reached the point where it would not stay either. She called out level-voiced and clear. I need doctor. Say this bay now. Possible internal hemorrhage post-op day 3. Harmon heard her. He was awake. His eyes moved to her face with the expression of someone trying to read a situation from a person who is deliberately not showing them the full picture. How bad, he asked. Bad enough that I'm calling a surgeon, she said. Not bad enough that I'm making promises I can't keep. But I need you to stay still and let me work. He stayed still. He was a service member. Whatever else was complicated. About the men and women who came through this ward, most of them, when you told them clearly what you needed, could hold themselves together long enough to give you the space to do your job. Dr. Emmanuel Osi arrived in the bay in under 6 minutes, took one look at the ultrasound screen, and started issuing orders in the rapid, quiet way of a surgeon who has decided a situation has moved past assessment and into action. He had a surgical team assembled in the hallway within 8 minutes. Harmon was being transferred to the OR within 12. Sarah walked beside the gurney as far as the elevator. Harmon reached up and put a hand briefly on her forearm, not grabbing, just contact, the kind that meant something without needing words. She acknowledged it with a nod. He was gone through the elevator doors before she could think of anything adequate to say, which was fine, because adequate things were often the wrong ones. She was back at the nursing station, filling out documentation when the second wave hit. It came in the form of a uniformed officer. She hadn't seen before a JAG lieutenant with the crisp bearings of someone delivering a formal notification rather than having a conversation. He had a document in a folder that he placed on the nursing station counter with both hands. The way you place something when you want the placement itself to be a statement. Lieutenant Sarah Calloway? Yes. You're being formally notified of a complaint filed by Commander Harlan Voss, alleging unprovoked assault on a superior officer during training exercise. He said it with the inflection of someone reading from a prepared text, which was exactly what he was doing. Pending investigation, your nursing duties will continue as assigned, but your access to non-medical areas of the facility is restricted. You are required to make yourself available for further interviews and to not discuss the details of the complaint with other staff. He paused. Do you understand? She looked at the document. She looked at him. She had anticipated something like this. Not this specifically, not this quickly, but the general shape of it. Voss was out of the building, but Voss was not finished. He'd filed the complaint before the investigators had fully established their case, probably within an hour of her interview this morning, probably with Donlan's input, or, at minimum, his awareness. It was a chess move, it always was. You hit someone, they don't go down. You immediately position yourself as the victim and force them to spend the next several weeks proving a negative while your own situation is simultaneously resolved in your favor. I understand, she said. He left Patty, had heard every word of it from 6 feet away, and had said nothing, which was its own form of statement. Now she looked at Sarah with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite anger, but somewhere in the productive territory between them. You going to be okay? She asked. I'm going to finish documenting Harmon's transfer, Sarah said. Then I'm going to call my representation. Patty nodded. He's in good hands in that OR. She said, is the best we've got. I know, Sarah said. I read the surgical roster my first morning. The documentation took 20 minutes. The call to her legal representative took another 15 and consisted mostly of her laying out the facts in the sequence she'd been trained from the beginning of the incident, not from the middle of it, because people who started from the middle left gaps that attorneys later used to widen into spaces large enough to lose cases in. Her JAG representative was a woman named Lieutenant Commander Aisha Barlow, who had a voice like someone doing a controlled burn, steady, methodical clearing ground. Filed fast, Barlow said when Sarah finished. Yes, that's actually useful to us. It means the filing was reactive, not strategic. He didn't have time to coordinate the content with legal counsel before submitting. Donlan? I'm aware of Donlan, Barlow said, and didn't elaborate, which meant she'd already been briefed at a level that precluded open discussion on a standard line. There's something else, Sarah said. She told Barlow about Rourke's count. 23 complaints. The pattern of targeting. Barlow was quiet for a moment. How do you know the count? Rourke told me. He's been in contact with the JSOC legal team. Another pause longer this time. All right, here's what you do. You go back to your ward. You do your job exactly the way you've been doing it. You don't discuss the complaint with anyone on staff. You document every interaction with command personnel from this point forward, times, names, verbatim language where you can manage it. And if anyone tries to modify your duties or access us in a way that wasn't in that notification document, you call me before you comply. Understood? Calloway. Barlow's voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but with a different quality. I've looked at your background. The parts I'm cleared to look at. Sarah waited. You know how to sit in a bad position without moving, Barlow said. That's going to matter more in the next 2 weeks than anything else. She ended the call, sat in the break room for exactly 2 minutes, looking at the parking lot, the Honda with the cracked mirror, the flat October light on the asphalt, the ordinary texture of a day that had started with a man's voice at her door and was ending with her name on a formal complaint document and a surgical team somewhere above her in this building trying to stop a man's body from bleeding. She thought about Voss's face when he got up off the mat, the machinery re-engaging, the calculation beginning again. She thought about 23 complaints. She thought about what Rourke had said, that Voss went after people who looked like they had no institutional weight behind them, people whose records looked thin, people he believed would absorb it and go quiet and allow the system to do the thing the system did, which was to prefer its own equilibrium over the inconvenience of justice. Her record looked thin because the thickest parts of it existed in files that required clearances to open, because the years she'd spent in theaters she couldn't name, doing work that wasn't categorized under anything visible, had been put somewhere that a base-level background check would not find. Voss had looked at her gaps and seen nothing. He hadn't understood that the gaps were the record. Her phone buzzed. Rourke. Calloway, we have a problem. She stood up. What? One of Voss's former accusers, a woman named Specialist Dina Ferris. She filed against him in 2019. She's been contacted by someone inside Hartwell's administrative structure. Someone warned her that the current investigation might resurface her case and told her it would go easier for everyone if she declined to give a statement. The room felt different in the way rooms felt when something had just shifted from complicated to serious. That's witness tampering. Yes, Rourke said. And the investigators don't know yet because she only just told me. She trusts me. We served together before she transitioned out. You need to tell the DOD team tonight. I know that. I'm calling you because Calloway, she's scared. She's been scared for 4 years. She went through the process once, and it disappeared on her. And now someone's telling her it'll disappear again, and that speaking up will only make things worse for her, personally. Sarah understood what he was asking without him asking it. What's her number? Are you sure? What's her number, Rourke? He gave it to her. She wrote it on the back of her documentation folder and looked at it for a moment, 11 digits that connected to a person who had tried once to be heard and had been told by the mechanism of the institution that she wasn't, that what had happened to her wasn't enough, that the calculus of protection and liability had run its numbers and come out on the other side of her. She picked up her phone. Outside the break room window, a car she didn't recognize pulled slowly into the staff lot. It parked near the administrative wing entrance. 2 people got out, plainclothes, lanyards, the studied casualness of people who were not casual. They stood for a moment talking, looking at something on a phone screen, then walked inside. She dialed Dina Ferris's number. It rang 4 times. 5. She was about to let it go to voicemail when the line picked up silence. First, the sounds of someone who had answered without deciding yet whether they were going to speak. Specialist Ferris, Sarah said. My name is Sarah Calloway. I'm a nurse at Hartwell. I'm not calling because anyone asked me to. I'm calling because someone told me you might need to hear from someone who's standing inside this thing right now. And I wanted you to know that the people who came in this morning, the ones with the lanyards, they are not the same system that buried your complaint in 2019. Silence on the line. Then very quietly, how do you know that? Because Voss put me on the floor of the training hall yesterday and filed a complaint against me today. And if he'd been able to make that disappear, he would have already. A long pause. Something on the other end of the line that might have been breathing, or might have been the particular sound a person makes when they are deciding whether to trust something they have learned very carefully not to trust. He told me in 2019 that it would be my word against his, Ferris said. That's what the review board basically concluded. I know, Sarah said. But there were 23 of you. Another silence. Longer 23, Ferris repeated. At least. The line was quiet for long enough that Sarah thought the woman might have ended the call without sound. Then Ferris said very carefully, as if she were picking up something she'd set down years ago and wasn't sure yet if it would hold her weight. When do they need my statement? Sarasa looked at the 2 plainclothes investigators who had just walked into her building, people who had been building a file for 8 months, who now had a witness tampering issue, that was going to crack open the command structure above Voss in ways that the people who'd made the call to Dina Ferris had clearly not thought through. "I'll find out," Sarah said. "Don't talk to anyone else until you hear from the DoD team directly. Don't let anyone pressure you before then." "Okay," Ferris said. "Then who are you exactly?" "You said you're a nurse." "I'm a nurse," Sarah said. She meant it. Whatever else was in the gaps of her record, whatever the classified files said, whatever Rourke had recognized in the technique she'd used on a training mat right now. In this building, she was the person who had checked Wes Harmon's temperature 6 times today and caught what the monitors had not yet shown, who had walked beside a gurney to an elevator and nodded at a man who'd needed acknowledgement more than reassurance, who had spent the hours between all of this, doing the work that nobody dramatic or important ever noticed because it happened at a bedside in a recovered ward on an ordinary shift. She was a nurse. But upstairs in that operating room, surgical hands were doing what her observation had made possible. And down the hall, the investigators were about to learn that someone inside Hartwell had tried to silence a witness. And in the morning, a woman named Dina Ferris was going to pick up a phone and give a statement that she had tried to give once before and had been told didn't matter. Voss had looked at all of them and done the same math. He had gotten every single variable wrong. She ended the call and sat with the phone face down on the break room table for a moment, not thinking about anything in particular, which was the closest she got to rest. Then she stood up and went back to work. The surgical ward at night had a different quality than it did during the day. Quieter in a way that wasn't actually quiet, more like the noise had changed register. The monitors kept their rhythms. Patients who slept badly coughed, shifted, pressed call buttons, and then sometimes released them without following through, as if they'd thought better of needing something. The overnight staff moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to do most things without turning on full lights. Sarah wasn't on overnight, she stayed anyway. Patty caught her at the nursing station at 2100 and gave her a look that communicated several things at once, none of them requiring words. The main one being that she was aware Sarah had no medical reason to still be in the building. "Harmon's not out yet," Sarah said. "I know, I'll go when he's out." Patty set a cup of coffee on the counter next to her, without comment, and went to check on Dale Fuchs, who had apparently developed an opinion about his drainage rate that he wanted someone to hear. The call came at 2214. Not from the OR, from Osai's resident, a third-year named Kwame Taft, who had the strained precision of someone delivering information he'd been coached to deliver carefully. He told her that the procedure had gone longer than anticipated, that the bleed had been more established than the initial ultrasound suggested, that they'd identified and controlled the source, and that Harmon was in recovery and stable. "He's going to be fine," Taft said, and then seemed to hear himself and recalibrated slightly. "The attending is confident in the outcome." "Thank you," Sarah said. She finished the coffee, collected her bag, said goodnight to the overnight charge, and walked outside's entrance into the parking lot, where the October air had gone properly cold since morning, the kind of cold that clarified everything it touched. She drove home. She did not sleep particularly well. The next morning arrived like most mornings did, inside an active investigation with the surface texture of ordinary institutional life and the structural feel of something wound tight underneath. People moved through Hartwell's corridors with a careful normalcy, the kind that required effort, that you could see in the fractional hesitations before conversations and the way eyes moved to doorways when certain names came up. Voss's name had stopped being spoken in the open. Donlan's name was being spoken very quietly, in places where the speaker had already checked who else was nearby. Saris knew this not because anyone told her directly, but because she had spent years in environments where information moved through what people didn't say as much as what they did, and she had learned to read that frequency the same way she read vital signs, not from a single indicator, but from the pattern of them together. She arrived at the ward at 645 and found Patty already there, which was not unusual, and Rourke's sitting in the hallway outside the ward entrance, which was... He stood when he saw her. He had the look of someone who had not slept at all, and had made peace with that fact some hours ago. "Ferris gave her statement last night," he said. "She called the DoD team at 11, talked for 2 hours. Sarah felt something settle, not dramatically, just the quiet adjustment of a weight that had been held at an angle. Good. That's not what I need to tell you." He moved slightly so they were both facing the same direction, both looking down the corridor rather than at each other. It was the posture of people saying something they didn't want read off their faces. The investigators found the name. The person who called Ferris to warn her off giving a statement. She waited. It wasn't Donlan. She looked at him then. It was a staff officer named Major Clifton Reese. Rourke said. He's been at Hartwell 6 months. He's Donlan's adjutant. But the investigators traced the call and then pulled his communication records. And what they found Calloway, Reese wasn't acting on Donlan's orders. He was acting on his own initiative because Reese has his own exposure. He filed a supporting statement in 2021 when a complaint against Voss went through the review process. He vouched for Voss's character. He helped the board conclude the complaint was unsubstantiated. So he's protecting himself. He's been protecting himself for 3 years and didn't know anyone was looking. Until yesterday when the investigators showed up and he panicked. The hallway was quiet enough that she could hear the ward monitors through the closed door. She turned this over the way the thing kept expanding, kept revealing that it was larger than the last version of itself. Voss wasn't the ceiling. The complaint suppression wasn't one person. It was a structure, the kind that builds itself out of each individual's small decisions to protect their own position, until eventually the whole thing is load-bearing, and none of the individual pieces can be removed without the rest beginning to shift. Reese calling Ferris, she said. That's the thread that unravels it. That's what Gale thinks, Rourke said. He called me this morning. He's moving faster now. They've expanded the investigation to include the 2021 review process. She nodded. Okay, there's something else. He finally looked at her. Voss's attorney submitted a supplemental filing on the assault complaint last night. They're arguing that your background, your classified background, specifically raises questions about whether your response was trained for offensive rather than defensive purposes, and whether the level of force you used was proportional for a trained operator versus what would be proportional for a standard medical officer. She was quiet for a moment. They're trying to use the classification against you, she said. They can't access what's in the file, but they can argue that the existence of classified training implies a capability set that changes the proportionality calculus. It was not without logic. It was the kind of move that didn't need to win it, only needed to introduce enough complexity to slow the process, to keep her status uncertain long enough for Voss's situation to resolve, for the momentum of the investigation to move past its peak, before her clearance came through in its full form. Barlow's knows, she asked. I called her before I called you. What did she say? Something moved across Rourke's face, not amusement exactly, but the adjacent thing. She said, and I'm quoting, "Tell Calloway to do her job and let me do mine." She did her job. Harmon was transferred back from recovery to the surgical ward at 900, still more sedated than alert, with OC's post-operative notes attached to his chart detailing what they'd found and what they'd done about it. The bleed had originated from a small vessel adjacent to the surgical site, not a failure of the original procedure, but a delayed complication of the kind that was documented in the literature, and was precisely why post-operative patients required the level of monitoring they did. If it had gone unnoticed another 4 to 6 hours, the outcome assessment would have been different. Sosie stopped by the ward mid-morning and found Sarah at Harmon's bedside adjusting his IV line. The surgeon looked at her for a moment before he spoke, which was, she had noticed, a habit of his. He didn't lead with words. The ultrasound call was right, he said. The clinical picture you documented from morning rounds the aggregate of it. That's what got us in there in time. Thank you, she said. I'm telling you it was a sound clinical judgment, not a lucky guess. I know the difference, she said, without edge. Just stating a fact. He nodded once, in the way of someone who'd confirmed something they'd suspected, and left. Harmon drifted in and out through the morning. When he surfaced enough to be coherent, he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who understood they'd been close to something and hadn't been told the full dimensions of it. You're the one who caught it, he said. His voice was still rough from intubation. I flagged it. Dr. Osi fixed it. That's not what the recovery nurse told me. Recovery nurses are thorough, she said. How's your pain on a real scale, not the one where you try to seem fine? He almost smiled. 7. I'm going to adjust your pain management. You'll feel better in about 20 minutes, and you're going to want to go to sleep. Let yourself. Yes, ma'am, he said, which was the most sincere thing she'd heard anyone say to her in days. The next escalation came at 1,340, and it came from a direction she hadn't fully accounted for. She was in the medication room when Patty came in and closed the door, which was unusual enough to make Sarsa set down what she was doing and give her full attention. There's a meeting happening right now in Donlan's conference room, Patty said. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering news. They don't want to be the one delivering. Don Reese, 2 JAG officers, and the DOD team. Gale's in there. That's the investigation, Sarah said. The investigation isn't what I'm talking about. Patty folded her arms. One of the administrative staff overheard the set conversation before the room closed. Donlan is arguing that your suspension from non-medical areas should be extended to a full-duty suspension pending the outcome of Voss's complaint against you. He's making the case that your continued presence on the ward creates a liability issue for the facility. Sarah was quiet. He can't do that without a formal board ruling, she said. He's arguing that the temporary authority he has during the investigation period gives him discretionary suspension powers for personnel under active complaint review. Patty looked at her steadily. I don't know if that's legally correct, but if he issues that order, you'd be off the ward, for anyone can push back through proper channels. And Barlow, you'd need to reach her before the order is issued. Once it's issued, it's harder to contest in real time. She paused. There's also something else. Gail's team knows about this meeting. They apparently weren't informed it was happening. Someone on the administrative staff sent them a note 20 minutes ago. Sarah thought about that. The DoD investigators hadn't been invited to a meeting inside the facility they were investigating, which meant Donlan had either forgotten they were there or had decided badly that his existing command authority was still functioning the way it had before people with DoD lanyards started walking through his building. Gail's going to walk into that room, Sarah said. Probably. When? The note went 20 minutes ago, Patty said. I'd guess 10 minutes, maybe less. She pulled out her phone and called Barlow. It went to voicemail. Barlow was on another line. She left a message that was specific and compressed, the way Barlow had taught her to leave messages. What? The legal argument Donlan was using, the timeline. Then she stood in the medication room and thought about what it meant that Donlan was making this move now. Yesterday, the investigators had expanded the scope to include the 2021 review. This morning, Reese's exposure had become clear. Donlan was watching the investigations get closer to the decisions he'd made over 4 years of running this facility, and he was doing what people with institutional authority did when they felt something closing around them. He was using the levers he still had access to, quickly, before those were taken too. The lever he'd chosen was her. If she was off the ward formally, under documented order, it disrupted her ability to function as a credible witness. Changed the optics. It gave Voss's attorneys a narrative. The person who assaulted a commander was suspended from duty, which implied there'd been grounds, which muddied the clean picture of what had actually happened in Building 7. She understood the logic. That didn't make it less infuriating. Her phone buzzed Barlow. I heard your message, Barlow said. Don't leave the ward. He can issue the order from his conference room. He can issue it. But you're a medical professional with active patient care responsibilities, and we're going to argue that a unilateral suspension without board review during an active DoD investigation constitutes interference with federal proceedings. That argument doesn't work if you've already complied with the order before I can get the filing in. A pause. Stay on the ward. Do your job. If someone comes to escort you out, be professional. Don't resist. Call me the second it starts happening. Understood. Calloway, the meeting in that conference room is probably going to be shorter than Donlan expected. The line ended. She went back to the ward and checked on Harmon, who was sleeping the deep healing sleep of someone whose body had just been through serious work and had come out the other side, and she charted his vitals. And she answered a call button from Dale Fuchs, who had now developed opinions about his meal tray. And she did all of this with the unremarkable steadiness of someone who was doing exactly what they had come here to do. 14 minutes later, raised voices came through the corridor wall. Not clearly, not words she could make out, but the specific acoustic signature of a conversation that had left the territory of professional exchange and moved into something that required more from the room than a conference table could contain. It lasted approximately 90 seconds, then silence. Then footsteps in the corridor more than 2 sets. Patty appeared at the ward doorway. Her expression said, "You should see this, but do it from here." Sarah walked to the doorway. Down the corridor, outside the conference room she'd never been inside, Captain Reeve Donlan was standing in the hallway being spoken to by Prentice Gale in a voice low enough that it didn't carry, while 2 other figures from the DoD team flanked the conversation without participating in it. A JAG officer Seraphin didn't recognize stood slightly apart with a document in his hand. Donlan's face had the look of a man who had just discovered that the ground he'd been standing on had been hollowed out from underneath him, and that the discovery had been public, and that there was no version of this moment in which he walked away from the hallway looking like someone who'd had the situation in hand. Major Reese was not visible. The JAG officer stepped forward and said something to Donlan, and Donlan looked at the document, and whatever was in the document produced a very particular stillness in his face, the stillness of a man calculating, in real time, that none of the moves he'd been planning were available to him anymore. Patty said, very quietly, near Sarah's shoulder, "What do you think that document is?" "I think it's a formal notification," Sarah said, "that his command authority over matters related to the investigation has been suspended pending review," which meant the order to suspend her from duty. The one he'd been in that room to issue was not going to be issued. Not today. Donlin was escorted, not dramatically but unmistakably, back toward his own office by two of the DoD team members, while Gale stayed in the corridor and made a phone call that lasted less than a minute and appeared, from his body language, to be informational rather than urgent. He'd expected this outcome. He'd come to that meeting ready for it. Sarah returned to the nursing station. She pulled up Harmon's afternoon medication schedule and verified the timing on his pain management adjustment. She flagged a note for the evening shift about his drain output. She did the things that needed doing, in the order they needed doing, because the ward did not pause for the institutional drama happening in its corridors. But something in the air of the facility had shifted. She could feel it the way she'd felt the arrival of the investigators. That first morning, not through any single signal, but through the aggregate of small ones, the way the body picks up changes in atmospheric pressure before the visible weather arrives. The structure was moving. It had been moving since the slap. But now it was moving in the direction that structures like this only moved when someone with the authority to force the issue had decided the moment had, and when the evidence they'd accumulated over 8 months had become too dense to route, around too specific to explain away, too documented to deny. At 1600, Sarah's shift officially ended. She logged her final chart entries, gave the evening charge nurse a verbal handoff on Harmon and Fuchs and the chest tube in bed 4, and was pulling her bag from her locker when her phone rang. Unknown number. Different prefix than yesterday's, not a local military exchange. She answered. Lieutenant Calloway. The voice was male, senior, unhurried in the way that people were unhurried when they had the authority to take as much time as they needed. "My name is Brigadier General Marcus Wyeth. I'm with the Office of the Inspector General. I'd like to speak with you in person tomorrow morning, if you're available." "I'm available," she said. "Good." A brief pause. "I've been looking at your record, Lieutenant. The parts I'm cleared to look at, which is more than most people at Hartwell are cleared to see." She said nothing. "The technique you used in the training hall," Wyeth said. "I've seen it twice before. Once in a classified training environment and once in a field debrief from an operation in a location I won't name on this line. Both times, the individual using it had spent considerable time in a specific kind of work that leaves very little visible trace." "General," she said, "is there something specific you'd like to ask me?" "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight I just needed to confirm I had the right person." Another pause. "The investigation is going to move quickly now. Faster than some people inside Hartwell would prefer. There will be pressure on you, not from our team, but from the people who are watching the walls close and still have limited access to leverage. I want you to know that we are aware of that pressure and that it will be addressed." "Understood." "One more thing," Wyeth said. "Wes Harmon, the patient you flagged yesterday. I spoke with Dr. Osei this afternoon. He told me what you caught and when you caught it." A pause that carried a particular weight, the weight of someone who was choosing their next words carefully. "You did good work, Lieutenant. In a week when you had every reason to be somewhere else in your head, you did good work." She stood in the locker room with her bag strap over one shoulder and said, "Thank you, sir." The call ended. She thought about the next morning, Wyeth's interview, Barlow's filings, the expanded investigation, Reese and Donlon and Voss in whatever rooms they were now occupying, with whatever attorneys they'd managed to reach. She thought about Dina Ferris, who had picked up the phone at 11 o'clock and talked for 2 hours about something she'd spent 4 years trying not to have to say again. She thought about 23 complaints, or more. The investigator's language had been careful, at least 23 confirmed. She pushed open the locker room door and walked out into the corridor, toward the side exit, toward the parking lot, and the Honda and the 40-minute drive back to the apartment that still had boxes she hadn't unpacked because she'd arrived less than a week ago, and unpacking had not yet felt like the priority. The corridor was quiet. Most of the administrative staff had cleared out. The DoD team's SUVs were still in the lot. They weren't done, not by a distance. She was almost to the exit when she nearly walked into a man coming around the corner from the facility's secondary administrative wing. She stepped back. He stepped back. They had a brief mutual recalibration. He was in his late 40s, civilian clothes. No lanyard. He had the look of someone who had been inside the building for hours and was leaving in the particular way of someone who wanted to be seen doing something other than leaving. She didn't know him. He looked at her name badge. Something crossed his face fast, gone, but not fast enough. Recognition. And below that, something she identified after a half second as calculation. He said, "Lieutenant," with the tone of someone using a title as neutral acknowledgement. He said, "Sir," the same way he went left. She went right through the exit into the cold. She sat in her car for a moment before starting it, thinking about his face. She didn't know him. But the way he'd looked at her name badge, that had not been the look of an administrative staffer reading a badge out of idle habit. That had been the look of someone who'd heard her name before, in a context that made seeing her in person a significant piece of information. She took out her phone and called Rourke. "I need you to look at the facility's visitor log for today," she said when he picked up. "Late afternoon, secondary administrative wing entrance. I just crossed paths with someone I don't know, and I need to know who he was. Can you describe him?" She did height, approximate age, build the clothes the direction he'd come from, the lanyard absence, the specific way he'd looked at her badge. Rourke went quiet for a moment. Then no lanyard. No lanyard. All DoD personnel and investigators are badged. All Hartwell staff are badged. He stopped. That secondary entrance, the sign in there is manual. Paper log. If someone came in through a side arrangement. "Rourke," she said. "Someone who shouldn't be here was in that building today. Someone with enough access to come and go through a non-standard entrance. And he knew my name before he read my badge." A long silence on the line. "I'll pull the log," Rourke said. "Don't go anywhere alone tonight." "Just start the car." "Rourke," she said. "How many people knew about the investigation before the DoD team arrived inside Hartwell?" "A small number. Command level." "And how many of those people have connections outside this facility?" "Connections with enough reach to put someone inside a building through a side door on 12 hours' notice." He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "The investigation," she said slowly. "It's been running 8 months. Voss knew. Donlan knew, maybe. But someone else knew too, someone who's been outside the frame the whole time. Someone the investigators haven't gotten to yet." The parking lot lights hummed above her car. Inside the building, the DoD team was still working through files, still building a structure of accountability that she had believed, until approximately 4 minutes ago, was pointed at everyone it needed to point at. "Get me the name of that man," she said. And then her phone showed a second incoming call, Barlow's number, marked urgent, and when she answered, Barlow's voice had lost the controlled burn quality that defined it and replaced it with something that was not panic, but was the thing adjacent to panic that highly competent people briefly became when the shape of a situation changed faster than they'd prepared for. "Calloway," Barlow said. "The DoD team just found something in Donlan's files. Something that wasn't in the original 8 months of investigation. A communication log from 2020. She stopped for just a moment. "There's a third name, Calloway. Someone above Donlan. Someone who's been running the complaint suppression from outside the facility." The parking lot light above her car flickered once and held. "Who?" Sarah said. "Colonel Hardin Sable," Barlow said. "Joint Forces Medical Command. He's been at the regional oversight level for 6 years." Sarah sat with that for a moment. The parking lot light held its flicker above her car. Somewhere inside the building, a DoD team that had spent 8 months building a case around Voss and Donlan had just discovered that the structure they'd been mapping had a floor they hadn't reached yet. "What's in the communication log?" she asked. "Emails. 2020 through 2022. Sable to Donlan. Donlan to Reese. In some cases, Sable directly to the review board coordinators. The language is careful, nothing that reads as an explicit order, but the sequence is clear. Every time a complaint against Voss reached a level where it required regional oversight sign-off, Sable intervened. He didn't kill the complaints. He redirected them. Requested supplemental documentation that was never formally required. Extended timelines past the point where complainants were still engaged. Let them die from procedural delay rather than outright dismissal." "Clean," Sarah said. "Much cleaner and much harder to prove, which is why 8 months of investigation didn't surface him till tonight." Barlow paused. "He has a relationship with Voss that goes back 15 years. They came up through the same command structure in an earlier posting." Sarah thought about the man in the corridor. No lanyard. Recognition on his face when he read her badge. Coming from the secondary administrative wing, the section that housed Donlan's office, and she now remembered from the facility map she'd studied on arrival. A small satellite conference room used for regional command visits. "The man I saw leaving through the secondary entrance," she said. Late 40s, civilian clothes, no badge, silence on Barlow's end. Then describe him again. She did. Hold on. The sound of Barlow moving, speaking to someone nearby, the brief back and forth of people exchanging information in compressed form. Then she came back. Gale's team is pulling the secondary entrance log right now. If Sable was in that building today, if he came in without coordinating with the DoD team, that would be obstruction, Sarah said. That would be significantly more than obstruction, Barlow said. It would mean he came to Hartwell after the investigation expanded scope today, without notifying the investigators, through a non-standard entrance. On the same day, Donlan tried to issue a suspension order that would have neutralized your standing as a witness. She stopped. Calloway, do not go home. Where are you right now? Parking lot. Go back inside. Find Rourke. Stay in a part of the building where there are people around you. I'm calling Gale. She got out of the car. The next 4 hours were the kind that didn't feel like 4 hours. They felt like a single extended moment in which a large number of things happened simultaneously, and the only way to move through it was to keep your footing on whatever was, directly under your feet, and trust that the people handling the adjacent pieces knew what they were doing. Rourke met her at the side entrance. He had his phone in his hand and the look of someone who'd been making calls since before she'd reached out, which, knowing Rourke, he probably had. The secondary's entrance log, he said, as she came in. Paper. Sign in. The last entry before close of administrative hours was a name. H. Salter Civilian Consultant, no facility affiliation listed. Sable, she said. It's not confirmed. But the physical description you gave me, I sent it to Gale's team. They're running it against Sable's profile now. He walked with her toward the ward wing. Not because either of them had patient business there at this hour, but because it was a known quantity, a place with clear sight lines and legitimate reason for their presence. If it's him, if he was physically inside Hartwell today, meeting with Donlan or Reese or anyone connected to the suppression structure, the investigators can move to detain him for questioning tonight. Can they do that tonight? With what's in Donlan's files and a positive ID on the building entrance. He looked at her sideways. Yes. The ward was in its night rhythm. The overnight charge, a steady, unflappable corpsman named Felix Arruda, nodded at them from the station without asking questions. Arruda had a gift for assessing which presences in his ward required explanation and which did not, and he had apparently decided this was the latter. Sarah looked in on Harmon from the doorway. He was sleeping. His color was better than it had been at noon. She didn't go in, didn't need to. She'd read his evening chart update before leaving, and the numbers were tracking in the right direction. But she stood there for a moment anyway, looking at the monitors doing what monitors did, converting a person's invisible interior processes into a visible, legible language that made it possible to catch things before they became catastrophic. She had learned to trust that language. She'd also learned that the language only worked if someone was watching, and that watching required presence and continuity and the particular kind of attention that didn't announce itself or require recognition to function. 23 complaints. 23 people who had tried to make the institutional language work in their favor, and had been told through procedural delay and redirected paperwork and the quiet weight of command authority that the system was not currently watching, that the monitors were running, but nobody was at the station. She turned away from Harmon's room and went back to the nursing station, where Rourke was now on the phone with his back to the wall. His face when he finished the call told her before his words did. They confirmed the ID. He said the sign-in log, the building camera at the secondary entrance, and a partial from the corridor camera near Donlan's conference room satellite. Colonel Hardin Sable was in this building at 1522 today. He left at approximately 1618. He looked at her. You walked past him at 1621. 3 minutes. If she'd left the locker room 3 minutes earlier, she wouldn't have seen him at all. Gale's team is moving tonight, Rourke said. They're coordinating with the Regional Command IG office to locate and formally notify Sable. Given the communication logs and the confirmed unauthorized presence during an active federal investigation, they have enough for a material witness hold. She nodded. And Voss's complaint against me? That's Barlow's territory. But with Sable in the picture, with the scope of what they're finding in Donlan's files, Voss's complaint is going to look like exactly what it is. He paused. A man trying to burn a wall behind him while the house falls down around him. She didn't sleep well that night, which was not a surprise, and which she did not fight. She lay in her apartment among the unpacked boxes, listening to the building settle, running through the shape of what she knew and what she didn't, the way she'd been trained to do in the gaps between action, not to resolve the unknowns, but to catalog them accurately. She knew the structure now, or most of it. Voss at the operational level, doing what he did to people he'd assessed as safe targets. Donlan above him, managing the institutional response, keeping the complaints from reaching the level where they'd require genuine review. Reese in the middle, a smaller gear in the mechanism, doing what small gears do, transmitting force without generating it, and in doing so becoming as complicit as the parts that turned him. And above all of them, Sable, at a distance that had kept him clean for 6 years, bending procedures rather than breaking them, using the bureaucratic language of oversight as a tool of obstruction. 4 men. 15 years at minimum, across multiple postings and commands. 23 confirmed complaints, probably more. What she couldn't fully map yet was the exposure, how deep each person's legal jeopardy ran, what the investigators had and what they still needed, how long the formal process would take, and what shape it would take when it resolved. She knew from experience that investigations of this kind did not end cleanly. They ended in the way that large structures ended, when they came down, in stages with ongoing reverberations, and often with the outer architecture still standing while the interior had already collapsed. What she could map was her own position, which was the part she was responsible for. Her statement was on record. Her clinical work was documented. Harmon was alive and recovering, and that documentation was clean and specific, and supported by OC's post-operative report. The physical confrontation with Voss was on camera. She'd confirmed this with Barlow, who had obtained the training hall footage, and had already viewed it with 2 colleagues. Whatever Voss's attorneys argued about proportionality and classified training, the footage showed what happened in the sequence it happened, and the sequence was not ambiguous. She was not the problem in this picture. She had never been the problem. She had been the location where Voss's problem had finally become visible. She got up at 430 and made coffee and sat with it in the dark kitchen and let herself think about what she'd come to Hartwell for, before any of this. The 6-month rotation, the understaffed ward, the work that needed doing. She'd wanted something simpler for a while, not easier. She didn't need easy, but simpler, more contained, fewer variables of the kind that didn't show up in charts and couldn't be documented and required a different part of her to handle. She'd lasted less than a week before Harlan Voss walked into a training hall and decided she was the kind of person who would absorb a blow and go quiet. She finished the coffee, showered, changed, drove to Hartwell in the dark. General Wyeth was already in the facility when she arrived at 620. He'd set up in the same second-floor conference room the investigators had been using, which now had the lived-in quality of a space that had been worked through the night coffee cups, stacked folders, a laptop connected to a secondary screen. 2 members of his team were present. Barlow was on the phone in the corner, which meant she'd come in person rather than calling in, which was its own signal. Wyeth stood when Sarah entered. He was a compact man, not particularly imposing in physical terms, with the stillness of someone who had stopped needing to perform authority, because the genuine article had long since replaced the performance. "Lieutenant Calloway," he said. "Sit down." She sat. His team sat. Barlow ended her call and took a chair to Sarah's left without preamble. "I'll be direct," Wyeth said. "Last night's developments have significantly altered the scope and the timeline of this investigation. Colonel Sable was located at his residence at 2,230 hours and served with a material witness notification. He did not resist. He did request an attorney, which is his right, and that attorney arrived at 130. As of 600, he has declined to give a voluntary statement." He looked at her steadily. "That's his legal right. But the communication records from Donlan's files are sufficient on their own to establish his involvement in the suppression structure, and his unauthorized presence at Hartwell yesterday, documented by entrance log and facility camera, is being assessed by the investigating attorneys for additional charges." Sarah nodded. "I want to discuss your situation," Wyeth said. "Specifically, the complaint Voss filed against you, and the question of your continued duty status." Barlow spoke before Sarah could. "I've filed a formal response to Voss's supplemental argument on proportionality," she said. "The training hall footage has been entered into the record. I've also formally requested that the Personnel Board, reviewing Calloway's status, consider the context of Voss's complaint, specifically that it was filed within hours of his own administrative removal in a facility now under active federal investigation, and that his attorney's argument regarding Calloway's classified background is a legal theory with no supporting precedent in military case law." "I've read your filing," Wyeth said. He looked at Sarah. "Here's what I want to tell you directly, Lieutenant, and I want it on record that I said it in this room. Commander Voss's complaint against you has no evidentiary support that survives contact with the camera footage. The supplemental argument about your training background is a delay tactic, not a legal strategy. It will not succeed. He paused. That said, the formal board review will proceed because it must, because due process applies regardless of how clear the outcome is to the people in this room. You'll be cleared. But it will take time that you deserve to be warned about. How much time, she asked. 3 weeks, possibly 4. During that period, your duty status remains as it currently stands active in your medical role, restricted from non-medical facility areas. 3 weeks, she absorbed it the way she absorbed most things, without visible reaction, with interior reckoning. 3 weeks of Voss's complaint hanging over her record, while the investigation moved through its processes, while his attorneys argued theories that wouldn't hold, while Barlow filed responses and Wyeth's team built the formal, evidentiary record that would eventually render the complaint not just dismissed, but demonstrably groundless. There's something I want to ask you, she said. Wyeth nodded. The 23 complaints. The people who filed them, what happens to their records? The formal findings that their complaints were unsubstantiated, does that get corrected? Something shifted in the room, not visibly, not dramatically, but she felt it, the weight of a question that everyone in the room had been aware of, and that no one had said plainly yet. That is part of the formal remediation process, Wyeth said. Yes, when a complaint suppression scheme is confirmed, when it's documented that complaints were procedurally misdirected, rather than legitimately reviewed, the original findings can be reopened and corrected. He held her gaze. It's not fast, and it requires each affected person to engage with the process again, which not everyone will choose to do. But yes, the record can be corrected. She thought about Dina Ferris on the phone at 11 o'clock. I went through the process once, and it disappeared on me. They should know that, Sarah said. Someone should tell them directly, not through a form letter, not through a process notification. Someone should tell them that what was done to their complaint wasn't a legitimate decision. It was a mechanism. Wyeth looked at her for a long moment. That's outside your formal role in this investigation, Lieutenant. I know, she said. I'm not asking for a role. I'm saying someone should do it. He didn't respond to that directly, but he wrote something down which she noticed. The rest of that week moved the way the early stages of institutional accountability always moved in public-facing silence, while the actual work happened below the visible surface, in documents and interviews and legal filings that would not be announced until they were finalized, in the particular grinding patience of systems that moved slowly even when the direction was finally correct. Voss's formal suspension from duty was extended indefinitely. This was announced in the facility's internal communication system, in the language that such announcements used administrative terms, procedural references, but everyone inside Hartwell, who read it, understood that indefinitely in this context meant what it sounded like. Donlon's command authority remained suspended. He was present in the facility in a reduced administrative capacity, pending the outcome of the investigation's findings regarding his role in the complaint suppression. He moved through the corridors differently. Then he had the particular collapse of bearing that happened to people who had been operating from a position of unchecked authority and had suddenly discovered that the authority had limits that were now being applied. Reese had been separated from his duties entirely and placed on administrative leave. His attorney had filed a cooperation agreement request with the investigators 2 days after his exposure, which was the move of someone who understood that the best negotiating position available to him now was information, and that the window for information to be valuable closed quickly when the investigators already had the communication logs. Sable's attorney was in active negotiation with the DoD legal team. Sable himself had not returned to any facility in the regional command structure. The material witness notification had become something with sharper teeth, as the investigators worked through what the communication logs contained. Serapha watched all of this from the surgical ward, where she continued to do what she'd come to Hartwell to do. Harmon was moved from post-operative recovery to the general ward on day 5 after his emergency surgery. He walked a short corridor circuit on day 7, slow and careful, with a physical therapist on one side and a determination that was very legible in his face. When Sarah saw him on that 7th morning, he stopped in the corridor and said, without preamble, I asked OC what would have happened if they hadn't caught it when they did. What did he say? She asked. He said probably another 3 hours before it became critical. Maybe less. He looked at her. You flagged it at 900. I know, that's almost 7 hours. I know, she said again. He nodded once. He didn't say thank you. She didn't need him to. And she thought he understood that the way Surfant's members, Surf sometimes understood things about the nature of the work without needing it. Explained. He went back to his circuit, moving carefully, taking the distance at the pace his body allowed. She went back to her rounds. The first public consequence arrived on day 11. It came in the form of a formal press statement from the Joint Forces Medical Command's Public Affairs Office, careful, institutional, stripped of anything that resembled the actual texture of what had happened, but containing within its professional language the words that mattered, that a command-level investigation had confirmed systematic mishandling of formal complaints at Hartwell Military Medical Center over a period spanning more than a decade, that disciplinary proceedings were underway against multiple named and unnamed personnel, and that remediation processes for affected complainants were being established. The statement did not name Voss, it did not name Donlan or Reese or Sable. Those names would come later, in formal findings, in the specific legal language of military accountability. But the statement was public. It existed, it could not be routed into a supplemental documentation request and left to expire. Sarah read it on her phone during the break room window period at the end of her shift. 2 minutes. Parking lot. Whatever was outside. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and finished the last of her coffee and went back to do the final chart check before handoff. Patty was at the nursing station, writing something, and didn't look up when Sarah came in. Saw the statement, she said to her paperwork. Yes, Sarah said. It doesn't say enough. No, Sarah said. Statements like that never do. Patty set down her pen. You okay? Sarah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I'm okay, she said, and meant it in the specific way that okay meant. Not fine, not resolved, not finished, but standing present, functional here. Good, Patty said. Because Dr. Marsh wants to discuss the new admit Bay one before you go. And she's already on her second cup, which means she's been here since before 6 and she has opinions. Sarah almost smiled. I'll go find her. On day 14, Voss's attorney filed a motion to withdraw from the case. This was not announced. There was no facility communication, no press statement. Barlow called Sarah at 1800 that evening and told her in the compressed, factual way she told most things. The attorney had cited irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy, which in legal language meant that Voss had refused to take the advice being given, which almost always meant that the advice had been to enter some form of agreement, and the client had refused because the client still believed that denial was viable. It's not viable, Barlow said. The footage, the witness statements, Ferris's testimony, the medical records from the training hall, the communication logs from Donlan's files. None of it goes away because his attorney goes away. What does he do now? Sarah asked. He hires someone else. Or he represents himself for a period, which would be a significant strategic error. Or he reconsiders the option his attorney just advised. She paused. The complaint against you is part of his strategy. If he enters any kind of agreement on the assault charges, he'll likely withdraw the complaint against you, as a condition or as a concession. That's the most probable path to resolution. Probable, Sarah said. Nothing in law is certain, Barlow said, but the probability is high. After the call, Sarah sat in her apartment. The boxes were mostly unpacked now, not because she decided anything in particular, but because living out of boxes while an investigation ran its course around you was a specific kind of self-punishment. She decided not to inflict and thought about what Barlow had said. The complaint against her as a strategy. The slap as a strategy. All of it, from the beginning, the way Voss had looked at her in that training hall and done the calculation he'd been doing for 15 years, reading a person for vulnerabilities, finding the gaps in their visible record, deciding that this one would behave like the others had behaved. He'd made one error that underpinned every subsequent error. He'd confused her stillness for absence. She wasn't absent, she never had been. She was the kind of person who showed up to the ward before dawn, to a patient's bedside at the first sign of a number trending wrong, to a phone call at 11 at night with a woman who had been waiting 4 years for someone to tell her the truth about what had happened to her complaint. She showed up in the ways that mattered, in the places that required it, with the particular quality of attention that didn't announce itself and didn't require an audience to function. Voss had mistaken that for nothing. He'd struck her in a room full of cameras and witnesses because the math he'd been running for 15 years had told him she was safe to strike. And now his attorney had quit, and Sable was in negotiation with federal investigators. And Donlan was walking through corridors with the bearing of someone whose foundation had been removed, and Dina Ferris had given a 2-hour statement that was now part of a federal evidentiary record. Day 17 brought the formal notification that Voss's new legal representation, a firm that specialized in military defense, had reviewed the evidence package and had advised their client to enter a formal agreement acknowledging misconduct. The agreement was in negotiation. Terms were not yet finalized. Barlow called her about it the same evening, and Sarah listened to the summary without interrupting. And when Barlow finished, she said, "The complaint against me, withdrawn as a condition of the agreement," Barlow said. "That's confirmed." She let that settle, withdrawn. The complaint that had been designed to muddy her standing, to introduce enough complexity, to slow the investigation, to use her classification as a weapon against her, withdrawn. Not because it had succeeded, but because everything built around it had failed, and carrying it forward now served no purpose except to add to Voss's legal exposure. "There's one more thing," Barlow said. She had a particular way of introducing the things that mattered, not quietly, but with a certain deliberateness, like someone setting a heavy object down with care. As part of the agreement terms, Voss is required to provide a full accounting of the complaint suppression mechanism. Names, dates, specific instances. The investigators need it to complete the picture above him. Sable, Sarah said, among others. Voss's testimony will be one component. The communication logs are another. The investigators believe that with both, they have sufficient basis for formal charges against Sable and a complete dereliction finding against Donlan. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "How many complaints, finally?" she asked. "The confirmed count." Barlow's pause was brief but present. 31, she said. "Across 3 postings and 11 years. 31. She sat with the number. It had started at 23, and she'd felt it then, the weight of it, the faces implied by it, the specific kind of harm that happened when institutional machinery closed around a person's attempt to be heard. 31 was that harm, larger than she'd known, extending further back than she'd known, built by people who had understood exactly what they were building, and had built it anyway, because the structure served them. "Calloway," Barlow said. "I'm here," she said. "Thank you. You'll receive the formal clearance notification from the board within the week," Barlow said. "That's my expectation based on the current timeline." The call ended. She sat in her apartment, in the dark, with the unpacked boxes gone and the furniture in place in the ordinary shapes of a life she'd been living in the margins of, while all of this ran its course. Outside, Caldwell was doing whatever Caldwell did at night traffic. A dog somewhere, the distant sound of a facility that ran 24 hours, never fully quiet. She thought about Wyeth writing something down when she'd said someone should tell the 31 directly, not through a process notification, that what had happened to their complaints wasn't a legitimate decision. It was a mechanism. She thought about the man who had no lanyard, walking out of the secondary administrative entrance 3 minutes before she left the locker room, whose name turned out to be the name of the person who'd been running the mechanism from above. She thought about the specific sequence Voss's hand, the crack of the slap, 40 people going silent, and below that silence, the accumulated weight of 30 other people who had tried to speak and been told, procedurally, carefully, and with great institutional deliberateness, that the speaking hadn't counted. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't have saved. She answered anyway. The voice on the other end was Dina Ferris. She sounded different than she had on that first call, not lighter, not relieved, but more solid somehow, as if something that had been uncertain in her bearing had settled into its actual shape. "I heard the agreement is moving forward," Ferris said. "Yes," Sarah said. "And the complaint against you?" "Withdrawn." "Good," Ferris said. "Then I got a call today from General Wyeth's office. They said someone had flagged. They said someone had specifically noted that the 31 of us should be contacted directly. Not by letter, by a person." Sarah said nothing. "Was that you?" Ferris asked. Sarah considered the question for a moment. "I said it to someone who I thought would do something about it. They called me," Ferris said, "someone on Wyeth's team. An actual person on the phone, who told me that the 2019 finding against my complaint was not a legitimate determination, that it was the product of a suppression mechanism that is now fully documented and will be formally corrected." She stopped. "Do you know how long I've been carrying that finding?" "The board's conclusion that my complaint was unsubstantiated. I've been carrying it for 4 years, like it was my fault the process didn't work." "It wasn't," Sarah said. "I know that now," Ferris said. "I mean, I knew it, in the way you know things when you're still trying to function. But someone saying it officially, putting it on record that the process failed me and not the other way around." She stopped again. "That matters. I don't know if I can explain why it matters differently than just knowing it privately. But it does," Sarah understood. She understood it in the specific way that came from having worked in environments where the difference between a thing being known and a thing being formally acknowledged was not semantic. It was the difference between a wound that closed and a wound that didn't, between a person being able to move forward from something and being required to carry it indefinitely. "I'm glad they called," Sarah said. "Thank you," Ferris said. simply, without elaboration. After the call, Sarah sat for a long while in the quiet apartment. The investigation was not over. The formal findings against Sable and Donlan were still in process. The 31 remediation cases were just beginning their own procedural journey. Voss's agreement was in negotiation, and the final terms hadn't been confirmed. The board hadn't formally issued her clearance yet, though Barlow's expectation was within the week. None of it was finished. But she thought about Wyeth writing something down, and a person on his team making 31 phone calls, and Dina Ferris sounding more solid than she'd sounded the first time. And she thought about Harmon walking his corridor circuit. On day 7, slow and careful and present, covering distance at the pace his body allowed. Things moved at the pace they moved. She got up, drank a glass of water, and went to bed. In the morning, she had a shift. And 2 days before Barlow's predicted timeline, while Sarah was in the middle of charting evening vitals on the surgical ward, her phone buzzed with a notification from the Military Personnel Board system, the kind of notification that arrived without ceremony, in a small window on a government interface screen, easy to miss if you weren't watching for it, which she had been, quietly, for 17 days. She opened it. The subject line read, Review Board Determination Lieutenant S. Callaway Case File 2024 H. 47. She read the first line of the body, and then she read the part below it, the part she hadn't expected, the part that wasn't about her clearance at all, the part that said, in the formal language of a military board that had reviewed the full evidentiary record and reached a conclusion that went further than anyone had told her it would, that not only was she cleared of all allegations, but that the board had formally referred the manner of Voss's complaint, filing to the investigative team as a potential instance of retaliatory complaint. Abuse, a finding that, if confirmed, carried its own separate set of consequences for Voss that existed entirely outside the misconduct agreement currently being negotiated. She set the phone face down on the counter, finished the chart entry, handed off to the evening shift. She was walking out when Patty caught her at the ward door with a look that said she'd either seen the notification or read it in Sarah's posture, which with Patty was always possible. Well, Patty said, cleared, Sarah said. Patty nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone who had known what the outcome would be and had waited without unnecessary commentary for it to arrive. Go home, Callaway, she said. Sleep, she did. But in the morning, before she left for the ward, her phone rang with a number she recognized now, Wyeth's direct line, and when she answered, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Something that wasn't quite urgency but sat close to it. Lieutenant, he said. Sable's attorney called our team at 500. Sable wants to give a voluntary statement, no deal, no negotiation. He just wants to give it. A pause, he asked that you be present. She stood in her kitchen, with the phone pressed against her ear, and the coffee she hadn't yet poured, sitting cold in the pot, and thought about what it meant that Hardin Sable, who had run a suppression mechanism across 3 postings and 11 years, with the careful patience of someone who believed they would never be caught, had called at 500 and asked for her specifically. Why me, she said. He didn't say, Wyeth told her. His attorney wouldn't elaborate beyond the request. But the offer of a voluntary statement, no conditions, no deal structure is significant. It means he's not trying to negotiate his way out. He's trying to do something else. When? 900. The conference room here at Hartwell, a pause. You don't have to be present, Lieutenant. It's not a requirement. I want to be clear about that. I'll be there, she said. She poured the coffee, drank it standing at the counter without tasting it, and drove to the facility in the early gray of a morning that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be overcast or clear. The second-floor conference room had been rearranged since the first time she'd seen it. More chairs now, a formal recording setup on the table, Wyeth's team positioned with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before and understood that the room itself was part of the document. Barlow was already there, standing near the window with her arms folded, and she looked at Sarah when she came in with an expression that communicated several things at once and chose not to voice any of them. Rourke was in the hallway when Sarah arrived. He was not in the room. He had no formal role in a DoD interview proceeding, but his presence in the corridor was the kind of presence that said, I know what's happening in there, and I am not going anywhere until it's done. She gave him a brief nod. He returned it. Sable arrived at 857. He looked different from the man she'd passed in the corridor 3 weeks ago. That man had carried himself with the practiced neutrality of someone performing invisibility, moving through a space with the body language of belonging there, of having the right to be there, of being someone the building recognized. This man was not performing anything. He was 61 years old, and he looked it, and the weight he carried now was not the weight of authority, but the specific, compressing weight of a person who has been watching the thing they built collapse piece by piece and has finally arrived at the moment where the collapse is complete. His attorney, a woman named Vera Tolan, who had the unreadable face of someone who had prepared her client as thoroughly as preparation allowed, and was now doing the thing attorneys did in rooms like this. Witnessing sat beside him and said nothing. Gale started the recording. He identified the participants and the date and stated the nature of the proceeding. Then he looked at Sable and said, in the neutral professional way he had, Colonel Sable, "You've requested this statement voluntarily, without conditions. You may begin." Sable looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up, and when he did, he looked at Sarah. She held his gaze without expression, the way she held most things. "I'm going to say what I did," Sable said. "Not what the attorneys write up. Not the version that goes through 5 drafts. What I actually did." He stopped. "I want her to hear it." He meant Sarah, because she's the one who broke it open, and she deserves to hear it from me directly. Barlow near the window was very still. "I protected Voss," Sable said. 15 years ago, I knew what he was capable of, and I made a decision that it was easier to manage him than to lose him. He was operationally useful. He was effective at a specific kind of leadership in high-pressure environments, and I told myself that was worth the cost of managing his behavior. He said it without self-pity, without the ornamentation of a man trying to excuse himself. He said it like a person doing a kind of accounting. The first complaint came in 2013. I was at the regional level. I read it. I knew it was credible. And I made it go away through the review process, because the review process gave me tools for that, if you were willing to use them wrong. Gale said, "Can you be specific about the mechanism?" "Supplemental documentation requests," Sable said. The review board standards allowed the commanding officer to request additional documentation before a complaint proceeded to formal investigation. Standard purpose is to ensure the record is complete. What I did was use that authority to request documentation that wasn't necessary, in formats that created procedural burdens, with timelines that ran past the point where most complainants could sustain engagement. He says all of this in the flat, precise way of someone who had rehearsed the mechanics, not the meaning. It was designed to exhaust people, not to determine the truth. Silence in the room. Donlan understood what I was doing, Sable continued. He implemented it. Reese assisted Donlan. Voss knew it was happening because the complaint stopped reaching consequence. He knew because I made sure he knew, because I needed him to understand that the system would continue to protect him as long as his performance justified the cost of the protection. Gale said, "And when did that calculation change?" Sable looked at the table again, briefly. "When a nurse put him on the floor in front of 40 witnesses and he filed a complaint against her the same day he was removed from duty." He looked up. I knew what that meant. I knew the footage existed. I knew his attorney couldn't make that picture look like anything other than what it was. And I knew that the investigators were already here, and that the investigation had been running 8 months, and that the only thing between them and the communication logs in Donlan's files was time. He paused. "I came to Hartwell that day, the day she saw me in the corridor, because I thought I could still shape something. Advise Donlan on what to disclose and what to withhold. Buy enough time for the mechanism to look less like a mechanism and more like a series of individual administrative decisions." Something crossed his face. I walked past her in the hallway, and she looked at me the way people look at things when they are cataloging them for later use. And I knew he stopped. I knew she'd already seen me, that it was already in her head, that whatever she'd clocked in that 3-second interaction was already information. Sarah said nothing. "I went home," Sable said. "I told my attorney what I'd done. All of it, the whole thing from 2013. He looked at Gale. "I'm not asking for a deal. I'm not here to negotiate. I want the record to be accurate. I want the 31 people whose complaints I buried to have something that tells them specifically what happened to their cases, not a general finding, not a systemic conclusion. Something specific. Their complaint was credible. I diverted it. I knew it was credible when I did it." He said this last part to Sarah directly. "They deserve that, and I'm the only one who can give it, because I'm the only one with the full picture." The room held the specific silence of people who were processing something that required a moment to be processed. Wyeth spoke for the first time. "Colonel Sable, the statement you've given today will be entered into the formal investigative record. The specificity you're offering regarding individual cases will require a follow-up session with the full case files present. Your attorney should be prepared for that." "She is," Sable said. "You understand that this statement does not confer any immunity or leniency. It will be considered by the relevant reviewing authorities, but the determination of consequences rests entirely with those authorities." "I understand," Sable said. Gail ended the recording. She walked out of that room and down the corridor and through the side exit and into the parking lot where the morning had settled into overcast without deciding to become anything worse, and she stood beside her car and breathed the cold air and thought about a man at 61 years old, saying in a room with a recording running, their complaint was credible. I diverted it. I knew it was credible when I did it. Rourke found her there 2 minutes later. He stood beside her, looking at the same parking lot she was looking at, and said nothing for a while, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. 31 specific acknowledgments, she said. He's going to put it on record for each one. Yeah, Rourke said. That's more than the investigation could have gotten through documentation alone. Yeah, he said again. She thought about what it cost a person to do, that not the legal cost, not the career cost, those were settled already, and Sable knew it. The interior cost. The cost of sitting down in front of a camera and saying, without the softening of excuse or the architecture of negotiation, I knew. I chose each time, I chose again. She didn't have anything like sympathy for it. Sympathy was not the right word, and she wasn't going to reach for it because it wasn't honest. But she recognized it as something true, something that took a particular kind of will, after years of a different kind of will. What happens to him? She asked. Formal charges for dereliction of duty at minimum, Rourke said. The attorneys will argue for conduct unbecoming, potentially obstruction given the Hartwell visit. He'll lose his rank, his pension's in jeopardy. The JAG team thinks there may be criminal referral territory depending on what the specific case reviews turn up. He paused. He's done. She nodded. They stood there another minute. Then she said, I have a shift. Of course you do, Rourke said with something in his voice that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. She was back on the ward by 945. Patty looked up when she came in and read whatever was in her face or her posture, with the efficiency she brought to everything and said, Good? Thorough, Sarah said, Good enough. Bay 3 wants his drain checked, and he's been asking every 20 minutes. She checked the drain. She did her rounds. She brought the same attention she always brought, not elevated, not diminished, the same calibrated focus that had nothing to do with how the morning had started or what had been said in a room 2 floors above the ward. Harmon was scheduled for discharge that afternoon. She saw him in the late morning, finishing his checkout paperwork, with the slightly distracted energy of someone whose mind had already begun moving toward the next thing. He was still careful with his movements, he would be for a while, but the carefulness now had the quality of discipline rather than pain, which was a different kind of careful and a better one. He saw her and paused his paperwork. You're not going to be here when I actually leave, are you? He said. Not a complaint, just reading the situation. Probably not, she said. You're tracking well. The discharge instructions are thorough, and Dr. Marsh has good notes on your follow-up. Yeah, he was quiet for a moment. I asked around, he said, about you. After the surgery. People on the ward know things. She waited. I heard about what happened in the training hall. What he did. He said it without heat, which was somehow more serious than heat would have been. And what's happening to him now? Yes, she said. You were doing all of this. He gestured vaguely at the ward. The building, the whole structure of the past 3 weeks was also doing this. He meant the patient care. The bedsides at work. The 900 ultrasound flag in the corridor walked beside the gurney, and the vitals charted 6 times over a single day because something wasn't right. And she'd stayed with the not right until it became specific. That's the job, she said. That's not just the job, he said. She thought about arguing. She decided against it. Take care of yourself, Harmon. Yes, ma'am, he said again, with the same sincerity as the first time. The formal consequences arrived across the following 3 weeks in the staged way of institutional accountability, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the documented, procedural, permanent way that mattered more than drama because it was harder to undo. Commander Harlan Voss accepted a formal agreement acknowledging misconduct across multiple incidents spanning 11 years and 3 postings. His rank was reduced. He was separated from service with a permanent misconduct finding attached to his record, not expunged, not sealed, attached, visible to any subsequent employer, any future background check, any institution that would ever consider him in any capacity. The agreement included his full cooperation with the individual case reviews for the 31 complainants, which meant his version of events was on record alongside Sable's and alongside the communication logs, and the convergence of those 3 sources left no interpretive space for anyone reviewing the record to conclude anything other than what had actually happened. He left Hartwell on a Thursday morning. No ceremony, no escort beyond what was required. He walked out through the main entrance with a box of personal items from his office and got into a car and was gone. Sarah was on shift when it happened and heard about it from Patty afterward, who had heard it from the administrative coordinator, and she received the information the same way. She received most things of this kind. She noted it, and she moved on. Captain Reeve Donlan received a formal finding of dereliction of duty. His command career ended with the precision of a thing that had been structurally failing for years and had now been declared officially failed. The dereliction finding would follow him in the same way Voss's misconduct finding would follow Voss as a permanent feature of his military record, a document that existed independently of any version of events he might prefer to tell. He was not criminally charged because the investigator's determination was that his actions constituted willful administrative misconduct rather than criminal conspiracy, a line that his attorneys had worked to establish and that the investigators had ultimately accepted as accurate enough. Major Clifton Reese entered a cooperation agreement that resulted in a formal censure and administrative separation. He was the smallest gear in the mechanism, and his consequences were proportionally smaller, which was not justice in the pure sense, but was the kind of graduated accountability that investigations of this kind produced when they were working correctly, holding people responsible in proportion to the authority they'd exercised and the decisions they'd made. Colonel Hardin Sablesel was the last to resolve, because his case was the most complex, and because the individual case reviews the 31 specific acknowledgments he'd committed to took time to process. He lost his rank. His pension was reduced to the minimum allowable under the circumstances of the findings against him. The JG team recommended criminal referral on 3 specific incidents where the documentation showed the most egregious and deliberate diversion, and that referral was accepted by the reviewing authority. He would face those proceedings separately, in a different room, with a different set of people doing the accounting. None of it was clean. None of it was complete in the way that justice was sometimes described, final, total, capable of restoring what had been taken. The 31 people whose complaints had been buried would go through their own processes, each one different, each one requiring them to re-engage with something they'd tried to move past. Some of them would. Some of them would not, and that choice was theirs, and it was legitimate either way. Dina Ferris received her formal corrective finding. In the 4th week, a document that stated, in specific and official language, that the 2019 determination against her complaint had been the product of procedural manipulation and was vacated. She called Sarah when she got it. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. She said it's in writing, and there was something in those 3 words that carried the specific weight of a person who had been told for 4 years that their version of events didn't count, and who was now holding a document that said permanently that it did. Yes, Sarah said, it's in writing. The commendation came on a Tuesday, which felt appropriately ordinary. No ceremony, a formal notification through the personnel system, the same small window on the same government interface screen, easy to miss if you weren't watching, which she had not been watching because she hadn't known it was coming. It cited her clinical intervention in the Harmon case, in specific language, the timeline, the early flag, the escalation, the outcome, and noted that her actions had been consistent with the highest standards of military medical practice under conditions of significant personal and institutional pressure. The final line of the commendation used a phrase that was standard in the documentation for this kind of recognition and that she had read before on other people's records, and that now sat in her own file with a different weight than it had carried. In the abstract, above and beyond the scope of assigned duty. She read it once. Then she closed the notification and went back to charting. Patty saw her expression, or the deliberate absence of one, when she returned to the station. "What was that?" she asked, tilting her head toward the phone. "Commendation," Sarah said, "for Harmon." Patty stopped writing, looked at her, and nothing. "It's documented." "Calloway," Patty said. "What? Can you let yourself have one thing without immediately filing it away?" Sarah looked at her. Patty had the expression of someone who had been watching a person operate at a particular level of self-containment for long enough to have developed opinions about it. "I'll try," Sarah said, which was the most honest answer available. Patty seemed to consider this sufficient. She went back to writing. 3 days after the commendation, Wyeth called. Not with urgency this time, the call had the quality of something considered rather than reactive, a conversation that had been decided on and then placed rather than triggered by events. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. Not an order. Not a formal request, a conversation, all right, she said. "There's a position being created at the Joint Forces Medical Command level. It doesn't have a final title yet. The working description is an advisory role focused on conduct standards and training protocols across military medical facilities, specifically looking at the systems and structures that allowed the situation at Hartwell to persist for as long as it did. He paused. We want someone who understands both sides of that, the medical environment and the command structure. Someone who has direct experience with what happens when those systems fail the people inside them. She was quiet for a moment. Why me? She asked. Because you spent 3 weeks under an active complaint, under institutional pressure, while a federal investigation ran through the facility you were working in, and you caught a post-operative bleed that 2 shifts of monitoring had missed. His voice had a particular quality, not flattery, something more functional than that. Because you called a woman at 11 at night and told her the truth about her own case, which was not your formal responsibility, because you thought it was the right thing to do. Because when Sable asked that you be present in that room, you came and you sat there, and you didn't say anything except what needed to be said, and it was enough. She stood at the break room window parking lot, the cracked mirror Honda, a flat afternoon sky that had gone from overcast to something with actual light in it, pale and clear. The position is advisory, she said, not command. Correct, I'd keep my clinical work. The structure would need to accommodate that, he said. But yes, that's the intent. She thought about what it meant, moving from being a person inside a broken system to being a person whose job was to find the places where the breaking was likely to happen and do something about it before it did. It was not a role she'd imagined for herself. She'd come to Hartwell for something simpler. She'd come to take care of patients in an understaffed ward, to have the work be the thing, rather than the context the work happened inside. But she thought about 31 complaints over 11 years. She thought about the way each of those complaints had been taken apart at the procedural level by people who understood exactly which tools the institution gave them and had chosen to use those tools wrong. She thought about the fact that the tools themselves weren't the problem. The problem was that the systems designed to catch that misuse had not caught it, because the people running the systems were the same people running the misuse. Someone with a different vantage point inside the medical environment and inside the command structure both might have seen it earlier, might have named it before it reached 31. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking, Wyeth said. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about it while doing rounds and charting vitals and adjusting drain outputs and answering call buttons from patients who needed the specific kind of presence that the work required. Attentive, unrushed, not performing anything, just there. She thought about the version of herself that had driven through the main gate at Hartwell less than a month ago with a cracked mirror Honda and a 6-month rotation order, and the intention to be unremarkable, to file herself into the background, to have the work be the whole thing. That version hadn't been wrong. The instinct toward simplicity, toward the bedside instead of the boardroom, toward the patient rather than the institution, that wasn't something she was going to argue with. It came from somewhere real. It had kept her functional in environments that had a way of consuming people who couldn't find the work inside the chaos. But she thought about Patty saying, "Can you let yourself have one thing without immediately filing it away?" She thought about Rourke in the parking lot, not saying anything for 2 solid minutes, and the particular relief of a person who didn't need her to perform anything. She thought about Harmon on day 7, walking his corridor circuit at the pace his body allowed, covering the distance that was available to him, not the distance he wanted. You went as far as you could go with what you had. And sometimes what you had turned out to be more than you'd thought, because the people who'd spent years telling you it wasn't had been doing the math wrong from the beginning. She called Wyeth on the morning of the 3rd day. "Yes," she said when he answered. A brief pause. "The position. Good," he said. Not elaborately. Just good in the way of someone who had expected the answer and was satisfied to receive it. She finished the call, set her phone on the break room table, and looked at the window. The parking lot was bright today, actual sun, the first real sustained sun in 2 weeks, the kind that made the ordinary surfaces of a parking lot look briefly like they had significance. She thought about what it meant to go through, what she'd gone through, and come out the other side, not diminished, not hardened into something closed and defensive, still capable of caring about the patient in Bay 3 who wanted his drain checked every 20 minutes because he was anxious, and anxious people needed the reassurance of presence more than the reassurance of information. Still capable of calling a stranger at 11 at night and telling her the truth about her own case. Still capable of walking into a room where a man who had buried 31 people's attempts to be heard asked her specifically to be present, and sitting there and listening and letting what was true be true without editorializing it. That was the thing that systems like the one Sable had built were actually designed to destroy. Not careers, not complaints, not individual people, though they destroyed those too collaterally as costs of operation. What they were actually designed to destroy was the belief that speaking was worth the cost of speaking, that the institution could be held to what it said it was, that the person who saw something wrong and named it would not be left alone in the naming. Voss had looked at her and seen a person who could be made to be alone in it. He'd been wrong about what she was. But more than that, he'd been wrong about what it would take to make her alone, because she hadn't been alone. Rourke had made a phone call the same night. Barlow had filed before the order could land. Wyeth had written something down in a conference room. Patty had set a cup of coffee on the counter, without comment, which was its own form of witness. Ferris had answered on the fifth ring and chosen to speak again after 4 years of not speaking. None of them had been required to do what they did. None of it had been mandated, documented, formally assigned. It had been people making choices in the small moments that systems didn't script, choosing to see someone who was being told they were invisible, choosing to act on that seeing, choosing to hold the weight of a thing together until the thing could bear its own weight. That was the part that didn't make the formal record, the part that would never be an accommodation or a board finding or a press statement, the part that actually held. Her last day on the surgical ward rotation was unremarkable in the way of days that don't know their endings. She did her rounds. She checked on a new post-op in Bay 1 who was managing well and needed mostly reassurance, which she provided without making it seem like provision. She helped Patty run through a documentation backlog that had accumulated because the ward had been short-staffed for 3 days, and nobody had had time to be rigorous about it. She drank 2 cups of coffee, both bad, both adequate. At the end of the shift, Patty walked her to the side exit. Not something she did normally. She walked with the deliberate purpose of someone who had decided to do a thing and was doing it without ceremony. At the door, she stopped. "You know what I told myself when you walked in here," Patty said. "First morning, I thought this one's going to be efficient and cold, and she'll last her 6 months and leave and not think about it again." Sarah said nothing. "I was right about the efficient part," Patty said. "I know," Sarah said. "I was wrong about the cold part." Sarah looked at her. Patty had the expression of someone who was saying something they meant without embellishment, because they meant it enough that embellishment would have reduced it. "Take care of yourself," Patty said, in the new role. "Don't let it be only the mission. Keep something for the bedside." "I will," Sarah said. She walked out into the parking lot. The sun was still there, lower now, cutting across the lot at the angle that late afternoon made of it. She stood beside her car for a moment, cracked mirror, last row, the parking spot she'd chosen on the first morning, because the facility map said it was closest to the side entrance. She thought about the woman who had chosen that spot. 31 years old. Prior service record partially classified. Here to be unremarkable. Here to take care of patients and file herself into the background and let the work be the whole thing. She thought about what Voss's hand on her face had cost him, and what it had opened, and what the opening had made possible for 31 people who had been waiting for the mechanism to finally break. She hadn't come here to break it. She hadn't come here to expose anyone, to investigate anything, to be the person who pulled the thread that unraveled the system. She had come here to take care of sick people in a ward that needed nurses, and she had done that, and she had done it well, and everything else had happened because one man had looked at her stillness and decided it was nothing. Restraint is not the same as absence. Stillness is not the same as surrender. The people who get mistaken for easy targets, the ones who don't perform their strength, who don't announce what they've survived, who show up quietly and do the work and keep their histories in the classified files, where they belong. They are not what they look like to the people who've decided to look without really seeing. And sometimes, when someone decides to find out the hard way what they've been looking at, they don't just discover a person. They discover everything that person's silence was holding in place. Every voice that had been waiting for a crack in the wall. Every complaint that had been buried under paperwork and procedural delay, and the comfortable institutional certainty that nobody would ever look hard enough to find it. 30 voices. She had not brought them back. She had not healed what had been done to them, or erased the years they'd spent carrying findings that said their truth didn't count. She had done something smaller than that, and more useful. She had been present in the right place. At the right moment, she had refused to disappear when disappearing was what the situation required of her. And in refusing, she had cracked something open that had needed cracking for 11 years. That was enough. That was more than she'd come here to do. She got in the car, started it, sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, and the engine running in the parking lot around her, doing what parking lots did, existing without meaning, just space, just ground, just the ordinary world that continued to be ordinary, regardless of what happened inside the buildings that bordered it. Then she pulled out and drove toward whatever came next. Behind her, the lights of Hartwell Military Medical Center held their steady illumination against the darkening sky, a facility that would wake up tomorrow and run its monitors and do its rounds and care for its patients with the same continuity that medical facilities maintained regardless of what had passed through them, because the work didn't pause, and the patients didn't pause, and the particular human need for someone to show up and pay attention and catch the thing that hadn't yet become catastrophic, that need was permanent. She had known that going in, she still knew it. That was the part that mattered most, not the commendation, not the new role, not the formal record that now contained, permanently, the truth of what had happened to 31 people who had tried to speak. All of that was important, all of it needed to exist. But the part that would outlast the documentation, the part that lived in the choices she'd made in the unscripted moments, was simpler than any of it. She had seen what needed seeing. She had stayed when staying cost something. She had done the work when the work was all she had to offer. And it had been enough. It had always been enough.